ICV2.com and Comic-Con have combined to come up with the 2021 comic book sales data for the entire comic book industry, combining comic book floppies and graphic novels and everything and digital sales all into one big package of very generic information. And guess what? Comic sales have boomed. They've exploded in 2021, talking about record growth. Now, we already knew that because we've already had some of that sales data, specifically from MPD BookScan, broke down in a very detailed manner. I did a big video on that one, talking about all the things we could learn from that. Now, there's still some things that we can learn from this analysis here. I'm going to get into that. I will talk about what ICV2 lead analyst Milton Greep, as well as Comic-Con's lead analyst John Jackson Miller, had to say about the sales data and what they have come up with. Now, I do want to read off these caveats before we get into the data itself. This is what they have to say, so you know that there are some things in here that are incomplete. Changes to the analyst methodology for estimating sales through comic stores after big changes in comic distribution and reporting in 2020 continued for 2021. The analysis now uses data based on sales tracked at point of sale by the Comic Hub system at over 100 stores. We have used the data to build a model of sales for the entire comic store channel using comparisons developed during periods in which Comic Hub and Diamond reporting overlapped. Analysis by Comic-Con and ICV2 was divided up between periodic comics, what some call floppies or pamphlets, graphic novels, and digital download to own sales. All print figures are calculated based on the full retail price of books sold into the market and do not account for discounting or markup. Digital sales do not include subscription-based all-you-can-read services. So those are some of the limitations of the numbers that we have. Now let's get into some of the numbers and some of the charts and some of the amazing explosive growth we saw in comic books that we kind of knew, but this kind of breaks out even better. Sales of comics and graphic novels grew 60% in 2021, according to a new joint estimate by ICV2's Milton Greep and Comic-Con's John Jackson Miller. Total comics and graphic novel sales to consumers in the U.S. and Canada were approximately $2.075 billion with a B, a 62% increase over sales in 2020 and up 70% from sales in 2019, the last pre-pandemic year. There's no two ways about it. This growth is amazing. As I've said here plenty of times on the channel, there are more new comic book readers in America today than there ever have been in the history of comic books. This is fantastic. We have a whole new generation that are addicted to comic books. They love the medium and they love the way that comic books are being produced for them. Unfortunately, I do have a feeling, and we'll get to it to more detail as we go into the analysis and the numbers that we do have, which is limited, that floppies themselves, pamphlets, regular comic books that come out every single month in your comic shop might be going the way of the dinosaur. It definitely appears that the graphic novel is the format of choice and will be the vessel that continues comic book growth into the next decade, along with digital. I think digital is going to keep growing, especially subscription services, which is one area that I think North American comic publishers are really struggling right now. They cannot keep up with Shonen Jump and some of the other apps out there, like Webtoon. Those things are absolutely generating a ton of money right now. Topping 2020 numbers was easily done as most brick and mortar retailers were shut down to foot traffic for periods during the year, but it was more impressive that numbers exceeded 2019's by a hefty margin. Graphic novel sales were especially strong in the manga category, and periodical comics also had a great year, easily beating 2019. According to Milton Greep from ICV2.com, while graphic novels lead the way, comic sales also exhibited high growth in 2021. Graphic novels were up an astounding 76% growth across channels, while comics were up 53% versus 2020 and up 23% versus 2019. Comic shops specifically were affected by the pandemic shutdown, and we did see a decrease in comic sales. So really the comparison should be to 2019, but 23% is very good, and it's something that we could have expected. I actually did a video not too long ago talking about the wonderful growth we're seeing in indie comics. Image Comics has some really big hits right now. Boom Studios have a bunch of really big hits right now. The Spawn universe is huge. Berserker's huge. Something is Killing the Children's huge. There are a lot of cool indie titles that have basically taken their spot in the top 20 and they ain't giving it up. And that is very good news. So we are seeing some growth, at least year over year, through comic books. It's going to look a little bit different as I get more into the analysis and we start breaking things down a little bit more. But you can't say that's bad news. That is good news. I still think DC Comics are screwing the pooch big time, but Marvel have more than made up for it. They're absolutely dominating the top 50 sales chart, but we're seeing indie comics really get in there as well. Another thing that we're noticing that we've never seen before, and I've talked a bit on the channel, is the rise of manga graphic novel sales within the direct comic book retail market. We hadn't normally seen that in the past, so it appears that a lot of retailers are adjusting their market strategies to really court this manga audience as manga grows exponentially, which is a very smart business strategy. Milton Creep also noted sales were up across all types of retailers. Sales through comic stores were up 60% versus last year and 34% versus 2019. Sales to the book channel, including book fairs, which were back in operation, grew at a blistering 81% pace. Digital growth, while slower, was coming off a gangbuster year in 2020 during the shutdowns. This is what John Jackson Miller had to say. The only sub-channel which dropped was newsstand portion of the other channel, and crowdfunding grew enough to offset that loss. It's good to see that your big book retailers and e-retailers like your Amazon, Barnes & Noble, Walmart, stuff like that, aren't the only ones benefiting from this enormous explosion. It's great to see that the comic book stores are getting growth as far as revenue. That is amazing news. I wish they were getting a lot bigger portion of this, and I hope that does kind of turn out that people start getting back into their comic shops and they really start experiencing massive growth. Comic store owners, they went through a lot during the pandemic. They showed that they have real backbone, and it's amazing that so many of them survived such a catastrophic shutdown, essentially, of the entire economy in a lot of states. So I tip my cap to those guys. You all went through the fire, and you've come out better for it, and you're experiencing growth. That's good stuff. Now, when we get into the actual details of some of the numbers that we do have, and like I said, this is very limited, so I'm going to extrapolate a little bit. I'm going to use my mind. I used to be an intelligence analyst, and I know how to look at numbers and see if we can glean some information about this. Here we have North American comic sales by channel starting in 2017, ending in 2021. You can see as recently as 2018, comic book sales through comic shops still were higher than book channels. But by 2021, book channels are absolutely dominating the market. There's been exceptional growth in the book channel. It's over double over that 5-year period of time, which is absolutely amazing. That is great that we're getting so many new comic book readers. I wish they were going to comic shops. Obviously, they did experience growth as well from 2017 to 2021. Obviously, we do have that big dip in 2020 when we had the pandemic shutdown, but it's much smaller in nature when you compare it to the book channel. There's a reason for that, and it's because the driving force of the growth in comic books is graphic novels, mostly spurred on by manga for adults and for kids like Scholastic kind of stuff, your Dogman, your Raina Telgemeier, all that kind of stuff. So that's where we're experiencing a lot of the growth. I wish there was more growth among comic shops between 2017 and 2021, but that is not the case. But there is marginal growth at least. But book channel is where it's at because it's all about graphic novels. Let's look at the formats themselves because we do have those breakdowns. I've added these lines just as a point of reference to kind of show you the trajectories. You can see this one expands out to 6 years. And if we go back to 2016 compared to 2020, it appears that comic book sales are essentially flat. There is little to no growth over the last 6 years as far as comic sales. But we are seeing tremendous sales for graphic novels. That is absolutely the preferred format for comic book readers in 2021 and have been for the last 5 or 6 years. They were already outselling floppies, pamphlets, whatever you want to call them, in 2016, but they're absolutely destroying them in 2021. I do think there's a chance, and based on this relatively flat line that we have here for comic book sales from 2016 to 2021, I do hope a lot of comic book retailers start looking into their demographics as far as the city that they're in, the readership that they have, and their interest in manga, because I think they could probably take a significant portion of these graphic novel sales from bookstores into comic shops if they wanted to be competitive in the market and they wanted to meet the demand that's there. Because that's really where the demand is. It's for graphic novels, and that's almost where all the growth being experienced in the comic book market today is coming from. And guess what? Marvel and DC are absolutely getting pantsed. I've got proof for you. Now, we deducted some information there. We were able to extrapolate some information and come up with some ideas of what's happening in the comic book readership as far as changing trends and dynamics as far as readers. But this is really the one that's going to drive it home to you. This is recent graphic novel sales through bookstores as reported by MPD Bookscan. And there is no comparison to what's going on sales-wise between superhero graphic novels and manga graphic novels. The number one manga graphic novel is selling almost 40,000 graphic novels, whereas the number one superhero graphic novel is selling 4,500. In fact, if you go down to number 10, Toilet Bound Hanaku-kun Volume 1 triples the numbers of Sand Book 1, the best-selling superhero graphic novel. If you even want to consider that a superhero graphic novel, even though it's out from DC, that is more of a genre book, but that is neither here nor there. And if you go all the way down to number 20 in the manga graphic novel sales, it still more than doubles the sales of Sandman Book 1. And you can see down there at number 10, Batman the Killing Joke, 1,200. And this list on the left, the superhero graphic novel sales list, is essentially unchanged month to month. And you can see the DC comics that are in there. The Sandman Book 1, reprint. Batman Year 1, reprint. Sandman Book 2, reprint. Watchmen, reprint. Batman The Long Halloween, reprint. Batman The Killing Joke, reprint. Nothing new in there. DC and Marvel Comics need to get with the program and realize what the changing market is. It's all about graphic novels. If you want to be a major player in the North American comic book scene, you need to be focused on your graphic novel content. And a majority of DC Comics stories that are being put out do not need to be put out monthly. They just don't. They're written for the trades. Why not just release them as graphic novels at this point? It is easily the preferred method of reading comic books in North America at this moment. Why not go out there and try to grab that market? James Tynions' The Nice House on the Lake, I think, is a great example. Sure, you can put that out in a periodic format. You can put it out monthly as a floppy. Why not just collect it out and put it out in volumes like your competitors that are blowing up are doing? And I think that kind of genre book, it's not superhero related. Obviously, it is still DC Comics since James Tynion traditionally a superhero comic book writer. But I think that thing could really go out there. I don't think it would beat manga right now, but I think it could compete with manga if it were released and promoted as a graphic novel. Sales for American superhero graphic novels are absolutely abysmal. They're in the toilet. They're getting dominated by everything. If you go to the top 20 graphic novel sales for May of 2022 and you look at it, there's not a Marvel or DC comic in there. There's one comic book that's not manga, Solo Leveling, which is a Korean webtoon. Everything else is manga. You need to understand who your real competition are. You can dominate the floppy market if you want, or you can help grow the industry and put American comic books back on the map outside of just kids stuff. It's embarrassing what's going on right now, and it's only getting worse year after year. Marvel and DC have no plan whatsoever to attack the market, to understand it, and to adjust with the market. Their digital strategy is non-existent. It's embarrassing. And their graphic novel strategy is just as bad. If you don't believe me, Brian Hibbs had a much better breakdown than what ICV2 and Comic-Con did right here. He broke everything down by the publisher, sales data, and everything. He made one of the best reports I've ever seen as far as comic book sales in North America. I did extensive analysis on this, gave my thoughts, kind of covered some of what Brian Hibbs had to say. Check this thing out because this is far worse than you could possibly imagine looking at the charts ICV2 and Comic-Con put out. DC and Marvel and the American comic book industry is really, really in trouble.